A 21-year-old stands on the edge of the Hellespont, leading an underfunded army thousands of miles from home. He takes a spear and heaves it into the Persian soil, declaring the continent his spear-won land. By invoking this ancient Macedonian tradition, he was legally claiming the entire territory as his own by right of conquest. This is Alexander III of Macedon. He has enough food to last 30 days and barely any silver in his treasury, yet he intends to dismantle the largest empire the world has ever seen. The reason for this gamble lies back home. His father, Philip II, had just been assassinated in a crowded theater. The official story pinned it on a disgruntled bodyguard, but the murder created an instant, volatile vacuum of power. Rivals to the throne were circling. To secure his survival, Alexander launched a high-stakes invasion into Asia, forcing his domestic enemies to either commit to his campaign or be left behind in the power struggle. Fortunately, he inherited a specialized military machine. His father had replaced peasant levies with a standing, professional army centered around the Macedonian phalanx and their signature weapon, the sarissa. This diagram illustrates the reach of these 13 to 24-foot spears. Because of their length, the first 5 ranks of infantry could project their points past the front lines simultaneously, creating a dense forest of iron that made frontal assaults by enemy infantry physically impossible. This formation acted as the anvil, pinning the enemy's center in place, while Alexander's elite companion cavalry served as the hammer, sweeping around to strike the vulnerable flank and shatter the enemy's organization. Alexander possessed the era's most advanced war machine. However, its effectiveness now depended on his ability to deploy these rigid blocks across thousands of miles of unpredictable terrain. This cross-section of the Granicus River shows why the first battle was a tactical gamble. The Persians held a steep, muddy bank, but they made the error of placing their cavalry right at the water's edge. This positioning neutralized their horsemen's ability to charge, leaving them stationary and vulnerable. Alexander led a diagonal cavalry charge straight through the river. He was nearly killed when a Persian noble's blade sheared his helmet, but the victory that followed solidified a belief among his men that their leader was divinely protected. A year later, King Darius III outmaneuvered Alexander, cutting his supply lines and trapping the Macedonians at Issus. Darius brought a force that reached the far reaches of his empire, vastly outnumbering Alexander's men. This map of the Issus battlefield explains how Alexander survived. The ground was a narrow strip of land between the mountains and the sea. The Persian army was physically too large for the space, preventing Darius from using his superior numbers to envelop the Macedonian flanks. With the Persians bottlenecked, Alexander drove a wedge of cavalry directly into the enemy center. This surgical strike toward the royal chariot forced Darius to flee the field, triggering a total collapse of the Persian lines. After the rout, Alexander captured the Persian royal family and treated them with the respect due to their rank. This was a calculated signal to the empire that he wasn't merely a conqueror, but a legitimate alternative to Darius. To secure the Mediterranean, Alexander needed to capture the port of Tyre. It was a fortress island sitting half a mile offshore, protected by walls reaching 150 feet high and supported by Persian ships. This blueprint shows Alexander's engineering solution. He ordered his army to tear down the mainland city and use the rubble to build a massive causeway, 1 kilometer long and 200 feet wide, connecting the island to the shore. For 7 months, the army braved naval fire and incendiary attacks to finish the mole. Once it was complete, they rolled 20-story siege towers across the water to finally breach the fortifications. The subsequent massacre at Tyre was absolute. By destroying a fortress the ancient world considered impregnable, Alexander broadcasted that no physical defense could stop his momentum. During his time in Egypt, Alexander made a hazardous trek to the Siwa oasis. After consulting the oracle there, he began presenting himself as the son of Zeus. This new divine persona allowed him to claim authority that transcended the traditional lineage of a Macedonian king. In 331 BC, the war reached its climax at Gaugamela. Darius had chosen a vast flat plain and even leveled the terrain so his 200 scythe chariots would have a clear path to shred the Macedonian infantry. This tactical map shows Alexander's geometric response. He moved his army at an angle, forcing the Persians to shift their cavalry to shadow him. As the Persian lines stretched to keep pace, a gap opened in their center. When Darius launched his chariots, the Macedonian phalanx simply opened its ranks. The chariots were guided into these harmless lanes where light infantry pelted the drivers, while Alexander drove his cavalry wedge into the central gap he had created. Following the victory, Alexander occupied Persepolis and eventually burnt the royal palace to the ground. This act was a cold declaration that the old Persian order was finished and a new Greco-Macedonian world had begun. Alexander became obsessed with reaching the world's edge. He pushed his army through the snows of the Hindu Kush and into India, driven by the belief that the outer ocean was only a few weeks' march away. At the Hydaspes River, they faced King Porus and a line of war elephants. The monsoon rains had swollen the river and turned the banks into a muddy trap, making the traditional phalanx tactics nearly impossible to execute. The Macedonians had to disable the elephants by attacking their feet and trunks with axes. While they won the battle, the physical and psychological toll of fighting these giants in the mud was the final straw for the men. When they reached the Hyphasis River, the veterans mutinied. After 8 years and thousands of miles, they refused to march toward the rumors of even larger Indian kingdoms further east. Alexander sulked in his tent for 3 days before conceding. He had neutralized every military threat from Greece to India, but the rain-soaked mutiny at the Hyphasis was an obstacle his will alone could not overcome. The march back through the Gedrosian desert cost thousands of lives to heat and thirst. During this disaster, Alexander famously poured a helmet of precious water into the sand, choosing to suffer alongside his men rather than drink alone. The return to Persia was marked by paranoia and grief. When his closest advisor, Hephaestion, died of a fever, Alexander entered a period of pathological mourning, executing the doctor who failed to save him and spending a fortune on a massive funeral pyre. In 323 BC, while planning an invasion of Arabia from Babylon, Alexander developed a high fever. Over 10 days, his health collapsed until he could no longer speak. He died at age 32, leaving his empire to the strongest. His political empire instantly fractured into decades of civil war, but his campaigns had already birthed the Hellenistic age. He had redrawn the world map, leaving the legacy of a man who conquered everything he saw, yet ultimately fell victim to his own mortality.